Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium. I would like to welcome everybody to the latest in our webinar series. This particular webinar series is one that we're having a lot of fun with. One of the main things we've noticed as a sea change in the last couple of years is that people have recognized from a security standpoint that mobile is another endpoint. For a long time, everyone kind of burying their head in the sand a little bit and just going, nothing happens on mobile. We haven't heard about a breach on mobile, so don't pay attention to that. Now they're realizing an endpoint's an endpoint. So we're going to talk about that. This little baby series that we're doing reinforces that point by saying, here's a couple well-known frameworks, well-known methodologies that have adjusted and embraced mobile as a starting point. And that's what they are, is a starting point. Last week, if you'd like to go back and listen, we did one on the CIS critical controls. And then today we're shifting to a framework that I've always really liked. I always thought it was cool because what's unique about this, and we'll dive into it, if you're not familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and we're going to get into it, the thing that's unique about it is it actually takes it from the hacker's perspective, whereas almost all compliance mandates and the CIS benchmarks, they actually take it from what do we do about it? So we kind of blend these two things together. So we're gonna run through this. I'm actually joined by a man who knows a lot about this stuff. The dude's a stud. Andrew Osborne is our VP of Global Solutions for Telco and Government. And he has a tremendous amount of experience, and so he's going to be helping me with this. And he even found a convenient spot in the middle of traveling at an airport to come in. So Andrew, thanks for joining us.
No problem, JT, and believe me, there's nothing I'd rather do than break away from the smooth jazz being piped in over the Atlanta airport to go and visit.
Well, it's our pleasure to take you away from that. So I'm going to be leading a significant part of this. Andrew is the absolute garniture in this entire thing. He's going to be the one to bring the spice and to bring some depth to the entire thing. It's going to be about 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to open for Q&A. If you don't have any Q&A, we're not one of these companies that makes it up at the end. We'll give you some time at the back end. And then, of course, we're always very willing to spend quality one-on-one time with everybody after the fact. So if you have any questions, use the Q&A. We don't use the chat session because we actually had trouble with it. So if you do have any issues, please just even use the Q&A for that. Also, standard stuff. We are talking about this stuff all the time. We are the experts in mobile security. So please follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever your preference is to stay on top of these things. So without further ado, let's dive into the topic here. I mentioned this. It has now reached a point where everybody understands an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. It doesn't matter if you have patient data sitting on a server or if you've got it sitting on a tablet. If you have patient data on there, you have to secure it. Cardholder data, you have to secure it. IP, you have to secure it. And in fact, in a typical enterprise, 60% of the endpoints are mobile today. These are 60% of the endpoints that are accessing critical corporate resources, email, etc., are mobile. One of the interesting things about this, and as we get into the attack framework, I come from the traditional EPP, the traditional endpoint protection side of the world. There's multiple differences between mobile and traditional endpoints in terms of how we have to look at them, even though it's similar that we have to secure them. So when we get into the attack framework, for instance, Andrew's going to be spending time talking about some of the things that are unique to the mobile environment. But here's 3 things I want to plant in your head before we go forward where mobile is different than traditional. First one, the kernel of the operating system is locked down. Great from a security standpoint. Most of traditional endpoint products can't work, though, because they can't hook the kernel like they're used to. It takes a different way of approaching the problem. 2, all apps are in containers and mobile. So whereas in the traditional world, we were used to apps coming in and going sideways through apps to remain persistent, which is what one of the hacker's main goals is, to be persistent on the device. In mobile, you can't do that. Every app is in its own container. So the only way to break out of that, you have to break out of that to be persistent across the board. But the third major difference of mobile over traditional endpoints, the user is the admin. So if you ask any security professional for as long as we've been doing this, what's the single biggest risk in your company? It has always been a carbon-based life form. It's always been a human being, right? Well, that was when we had these human beings sitting at workstations or laptops that were inside billions of dollars of protected corporate networks, sitting on billions of dollars of endpoint protection solutions with centralized patch management solutions, et cetera. Now you take that same person who's the greatest threat to a company, you give them a supercomputer, you make them the admin. There is no patch management system on mobile. The user has to update. The user decides what networks they're going to connect to. By the way, they're spending 80% of their time outside of the protected corporate networks. And then they decide what apps they're going to install and everything. So when we get in the attack framework, what MITRE has done is they've taken the existing attack framework and they've started kind of taking a first pass of what would it look like if you just kind of layered mobile on top of it. One of the things that Andrew and I are going to be talking about is this is version 1. When they start moving forward with this, and we're helping them move forward with this, there's going to be things that change in the framework for mobile because mobile is different. So people ask, are mobile devices under attack? Simple answer is yes. 100% of all of our customers, we literally have thousands of customers around the world now, tens of millions of endpoints, 100% of them detect threats. And it's kind of like, I joke, it's kind of like the FedEx logo, where once somebody points out the arrow to you, you can never unsee it. Now that you start thinking about mobile security, you're going to see things about it every single day in the press. So an example here. It's important to know, though, how the attacks are different. And I'm just going to hit this real quick to give you the forest. Then we're going to get into the attack framework to give you the trees, right? 4 basic attack types in mobile: device attacks, network, phishing, and malicious apps. I mentioned earlier, the hackers, for as long as they've been doing this, they have wanted to remain persistent whenever they've taken over any given system, server, point of sale system, whatever. In mobile, because all apps are in containers, the only way to be persistent is to actually compromise the device, to elevate privileges, elevate access, maybe get a malicious profile on there if you're in Apple. That's the only way to be persistent. So that is the sole goal. If we go to the other side, malicious apps, we just got finished with our global threat report. We did it at the end of July. There's a webinar and there's a report. If you're interested, please hit our site and snag those or listen to those. The vast majority of all malicious apps are fraud. They're untargeted consumer fraud. Zimperium is built from the very beginning, and if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, it is to protect enterprises against targeted attacks. It's not to protect consumers, okay? Now, consumers need to be protected. That's just not what we're focused on. Bad guys, phishing is a real issue, okay? 90% of breaches start with phishing, and 2/3 of emails are read on mobile. And in particular, personal emails are read on mobile. So the one thing with malicious apps or phishing sites is either one of them, even though they're untargeted and we don't see them as the primary attack vector against enterprises, they can deliver an exploit to elevate privileges and compromise the device. But the bad guys are very good at what they do, and they're very smart. We don't like them, they're bad dudes, but they're very smart, right? They know that the most effective way to target XYZ company is to set up a fake Wi-Fi network or do a man-in-the-middle attack in a network right by XYZ company's headquarters. Wait until they find somebody from XYZ headquarters that connects to their network, compromise the device. That is the most efficient way of being able to do it. And as we've seen, 90% of the attacks start with a network attack. So it's very important to kind of keep this in your head. Realize, even though mobile is an endpoint, so we need to deal with that, the attack vectors are different. The network attacks, we talked about, for instance, last week in the CIS webinar, things like man-in-the-middle attacks and stuff like that are almost non-existent inside the protected corporate network. So we've kind of forgotten about those on traditional endpoints. Now you take this little supercomputer and people walk around, it is the primary attack vector that enterprises need to worry about. So when we start looking at the framework, we're going to keep this in mind. Now, obviously, what are the attacker's goals? The usual: credentials, data, and weaponization. So with that as the view, we're now going to dive into the attack framework. So to start off with, Andrew, can you just kind of give us a feel for what is the framework, and then maybe just, some initial thoughts on how they've what steps they've taken to start moving it towards mobile as well.
Sure, JT. So, this was, and you've mentioned it before, it's a derivative of the original attack framework that was developed and articulated through Lockheed Martin and the cyber kill chain. And what they took is a pragmatic approach to saying, well, listen, we realize that there is a kill chain of how you protect a particular system, but rather we as MITRE want to look at this of how would you incorporate that kill chain into an attack category and technique parameter that you've got here in the deck, and we'll review in more detail. But ultimately, it's the beachfront, it's landing onto a particular device and being able to move through the device to either expose vulnerabilities and get and access those in order to unload a payload or to garner data for exfiltration, or ultimately the last two end game is to be able to sidestep through a network into more attractive targets once connected to the network of a enterprise or an agency, and for data exfiltration there, or to be weaponized, as you've mentioned here, from a standpoint of denial of service or distributed denial of service attack, becoming a part of the agent of the command and control to be an attack platform and vector for the for that host.
Yeah, no, I think, that's perfect. That's perfect. And like I said, for me, I don't know of another, and maybe you do, but I don't know of another framework in the security side of things that truly does take it from the attack stages, from the kill chain to the Lockheed Martin conversation, right? Like I said, all the rest of them prescribe solutions you should implement, right? This, at the highest level says here, and we can't solve everything, right? I mean, unlimited money, unlimited time, so you kind of have to pick and choose your battles of which one of these things do you need to find a solution against. But I just think it's an interesting flip to, it's like when I'm not doing startups, I coach football, right? And one of the keys to winning is doing your scouting report. You need to understand the way that the opponent is thinking in order to really adjust and figure out the best way to win, right?
Well, the bad guys have been doing that.
What are your thoughts about it? And do you know of any other that's kind of like this as a framework versus all the compliance mandates and everything that are more prescriptive?
No, and in fact, most of them, even the ones that they sub-reference from the NIST organization, the National Institute of Science and Technology, who actually puts in a lot of the framework for those protections, has not enveloped or developed and has relied on the cyber kill chain and then thus the MITRE ATT&CK from both a workstation, a server system now to and evolved to the mobile solution for how that attack set of vectors and plane coexist and roll over. And then they are then continuously updating one another for, here is how the bad malicious actors are performing against these areas, and here are the defenses, and then it's feeding. It's this constant loop of life cycle of evolution of updates to things that some may be familiar with, like the FISMA NIST 853 cyber controls for systems, and there are others that are non-government affiliated, but most of them all rely on this same type of pattern. So this is one of the more prevailing methodologies. And the bad guys have been doing to us what they're trying here to do, which is the discovery phase, the intelligence of what it is that they're trying to defeat. Right? They're looking for the moats. They're looking for the turrets. They're looking for a way to get into that castle and get to those crown jewels. And thus, this is a great way for not only government agencies who are affiliated loosely with MITRE, but worldwide organizations and enterprises in order to do the same thing. Right? What are they doing? What tools are they using? What weapons have they got in their arsenal? And how best do we do that? But ultimately, it's going to come down to, you can't look for a particular signature of a weapon. If it if it looks like a bow and arrow, even if it isn't shaped like one, and it's still firing at you, certainly it's acting as one. It's behaviorally, based in the model of one of these different attack stages, right? From, the persistence or the escalation attempts, or the evasion techniques, or discovery.
Right,
and that's
right. And you know what I think, and so we're gonna hop into, like you said, some of the more specifics. I think one of the important things is take guys like the Lazarus Group, right? Lazarus Group, North Korea, backed cyber army, famous for taking down Sony after the Interview movie came out, and purportedly the guys behind WannaCry, right? Well, I mean, they've literally publicly announced, and we've seen it. We've seen very interesting examples where they're almost 100% Android malware now. Why? Because users are the admin of these devices, and the land and expand strategy, which is basically played out here in the attack stages, is alive and well. So the fact is, the same guys that have been attacking traditional endpoints are now attacking mobile. They're going to go through the same steps, and they're going after the same objectives. But what's different, though, is the techniques they're using to do. So one of the things that's important on mobile, just one quick point before we get in. On mobile, for those folks that are new to it, because a lot of people that we get into when we have these conversations, we have mobile people that are not familiar with security, or we have security people that don't understand some of the nuances of mobile. One of the important things is to actually provide what almost every enterprise or federal government agency does, is they have a combination of a UEM, which used to be called MDM or EMM, Unified Endpoint Management, and MTD, Mobile Threat Defense, which is what Zimperium is. As a simple rule, we can get into details if anybody wants, MTD is the threat detection. We detect the things that are being tried here in this framework, for instance. Quite often, the UEM is the remediation option. So unlike traditional endpoints, where if you had an EPP solution, CrowdStrike, Cylance, McAfee, whatever the case may be, you could detect and kill yourself. Here, because of Apple and Google, in terms of the way that they've architected mobile, there can only be one leader on the device that's elevated privileges above and beyond apps, and that's almost always a UEM. And so we work with the largest set of UEMs out there. Matter of fact, we can handle multiple UEMs in a single console, which is totally unique to Zimperium. But it is important is for the folks that are new to mobile, as we get into the framework, to realize it's probably going to be a combination of those two. So what we've done with this is we've taken the framework and we basically said, we've broken it into primary and secondary defenses. The primary defenses are, what are things that can actually be detected and stopped directly by an MTD solution, quite often in conjunction with the UEM. The second part, though, is because we're stopping things further up in the kill chain, further up in the attack framework, there are things that occur, techniques that are used further down that don't occur because the primary ones stopped them. So for instance, I mentioned we did the global threat report last week or a couple weeks ago. When I was talking about it, one of the things that I mentioned is you need to understand that the device attacks, the device exploit numbers in our threat report are artificially low compared to the world at large. The reason I say that is our job is to protect enterprises. Our job isn't to provide research. We provide research because people are interested, but that's not our primary job. Our primary job is to actually stop threats. And so our network numbers are very high because, as I mentioned, 90% of the attacks start with a network attack. So we stopped it at the network, which means the device exploits couldn't get on there unless they came in a different way. So same thing here. We're gonna run through the attack chain and just talk about some of the things that are unique. But the green are the primaries, and then the grays, you'll see a lot more grays as we go further on, are ones that are stopped because of this. And we can provide these slides to anybody who's interested and run you guys through it. So first 3 stages, going from initial access to start persistence and hit privilege escalation. You know, Andrew, what are some of the kind of noteworthy mobile-esque things for people to pay attention to? Are you there? Oh, and Andrew said that there's an alarm going off where he is, so he'll hop on in a little bit. So for me, again, as they start coming in and they initially come on and they're trying to hit privilege escalation, the things that are somewhat unique in mobile, what are some of them, right? If you notice, there's a whole bunch of things that have to do with malicious apps, repackaged apps. That is, in fact, very important, as we've been talking about. So you do need to detect those. Charging stations, you've seen them in the airport. There's all sorts of different ways to deliver a malicious app. And even though the terminology here is around apps, it also can be exploits. So a lot of times you might plug into those USB things or whatever the case may be. It can deliver an exploit almost immediately. Any changes to the system itself in terms of the changes in the kernel of the boot, obviously you should be able to detect that. And then the OS vulnerabilities is huge because, as I mentioned, the user is the admin. What our research bore out last week is, or a couple of weeks ago, 60% of Android devices are 5 versions behind or more. So clearly that means, and they came out with, I think it was 500, I forget the number right now. I know Apple had 185, 60% of which were critical patches in the first half of the year. So these guys are patching all the time because there are known vulnerabilities that have exploits associated with them. So an MTD solution needs to be able to detect those. And I think we might have Andrew back. Andrew, are you back?
I am. Somebody decided to open up that door that says "Don't open" when they set up the alarm in the entire terminal.
You know, for some reason, TSA has no sense of humor when it comes to that. So as we move forward here, because we're at 23 after, and we're going to try and stay true to our word. The next set. So we just got finished with that. Andrew, what are some of the newsworthy kind of mobile parts when we go from their evasion techniques through discovery?
Well, a lot of it is about leveraging what is already in existence, and you mentioned the flaws, and quite frankly, that is one of the largest and most prevailing issues in the mobile realm. Even though Apple perennially and historically has been better about patch management and effectively being able to do OTAs, over-the-air updates, to ensure that they've closed those doors on potential underlying vulnerabilities based on either misconfigured code, and Android has been a more prevalent area to that. They're not immune. And to your point, we're talking about 500 versus 200. There are still an enormous opportunities for the malicious players to be able to insert code, or just simply, as you mentioned earlier in the call, to get folks to, in a network-based attack, to get them to install a malicious profile, which is giving them access to the device and control of the device, and allowing them to, intercept traffic or to be able to install, other tools onto the device unknowingly to the end user. And I know you've seen this before, and I cringe when I see this out in the industry. And there was a report just the other day on this very thing about, best practices. They tell folks that, well, you should just simply keep up to date on your code. You should simply just not click on links that you're not aware of. And unfortunately, you're relying on an end user to not get fooled. And training and education are certainly, aspects that are a part of the protection model and shouldn't be ignored. However, beyond that, trying to insinuate that, relying on education alone and an end user to, be able to absorb, the, enormous horde of potential tools and very well crafted either fake messages, links, network connections, is unrealistic and unobtainable. And that's the difference between that and the model which you had referenced before as far as the old legacy enterprise, is that, you have a sitting at a desk device which has, a set of both physical controls as well as logical controls and security controls, and here you don't.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. And, to your point about training, I was talking to a pen tester from Italy a little while ago, and they went in to do a project, and they tried phishing right off the bat, and it failed miserably. And they're like, wow, that's weird. And then they found out it's because they had done phishing training and they had hit the desktops with phishing. You know, that's where they were testing it. They had done phishing training the week before. They went back to the same company 3 months later. Phishing sailed right through because they hadn't done any training. So the life cycle of the memory had kind of gone away. So we moved to the next ones. This is when, again, land and expand is the key. Now they're going to start to move laterally, and they're going to start to do some collection of information. And especially when it comes to mobile, I mean, you get full contact lists. You get, their calendar, where they're going. You get their location. What are some of your thoughts on this stage or set of stages?
Right. So, again, the ability to, exploit and move laterally is relatively easy once you have control of the device. You have access to a wealth of data, either for exfiltration or for, again, to your point, land and expand, right? That proverbial Trojan through the door, and now behind the gates, and free to move around, and typically an undetectable method. If you have no visibility, and I think you put that up on a previous slide, that is one of the biggest gaps in today's framework for most mobile controls and mobile capabilities, is that they have perimeter defenses to a degree. They have access controls, they have policy enforcement, but what they don't have is the visibility for that detection. Because ultimately, when you look at all this, the very first thing that you need to do is have the ability of detecting the root cause of the problem, where they're landing. If you don't have the troops on the beach and you let them into your mainland and move around, it's going to be a far more difficult task, and you are potentially allowing for a greater expansion quicker than you would if you didn't try to stop the problem when it occurs. And ultimately, with mobile threat defense and Zimperium, our whole goal is to ensure providing that type of visibility, being able to see the, attack launch, whatever that may be, including, zero-day attacks, because we are looking for behavioral methodology. What is it that is happening? May not be a signature that has ever happened before, hence zero-day, but we know what types of things they're trying to do, right? Land and expand, lateral movements, collection, data exfiltration, putting down bad profiles onto iOS devices. All of those different methodologies, including just network scanning, are all, malicious methodologies we still try to use. And it's all, if it's widget X or, code Y, is rather relevant to us. We want to detect the behavior. What are they trying to do?
Right. No, completely agree. And then we'll hit these last ones pretty quickly. Anything, particularly newsworthy here? I mean, there's a lot of green when it comes to the network side, just very much, consistent with what we've been talking about, of the fact that these guys are out connecting to all sorts of random networks, whether it's cellular, whether it's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. What are your primary takeaways on this one?
Well, again, this is back to that whole evolution of the solution. When you get these mobily enabled devices, you're going to continue to have more radios in them. And we haven't even expanded or launched into the low energy portion of 802.15.4, which is going to be the IoT enabled, or just those that are, low emissions that are going to be coming down from, low raw WAN or Zigbee or any of these other type of radios under that guise that will be eventually put into these devices. So, ultimately the ability for detection of network intercept, man-in-the-middle attacks, those that are, trying to have folks connect to them, trust the network connectivity, siphon and or inject in at that point, is fundamental and paramount for the industry to evolve to.
Yeah, completely. So we are very close to the end of time here. So I'm not going to spend much time at all on our solution because I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A. Here's the quick punchline of the whole thing. And again, we're always more than willing to spend time with folks. It is critical to remember that 9 out of 10 times in a targeted attack, the bad guy owns the network, as you heard through the entire attack framework we were just talking about. What that means is, and we've known this from the very beginning, and Gartner now is reinforcing, you need to do all your detection on device. Because if you are relying on that network to get to a cloud-based detection, the first thing the bad guy does is cut that off. We had defense evasion techniques that were part of the attack framework. they'll just cut off access. So your detection will be headless. We're the only ones that do 100% of our detection on device. Machine learning based, to Andrew's point, you need to be able to detect things by behavior that have never been seen before. So across the vectors, we do our detection on device. The engine is called Z9. Z9 can be rolled out in one of two ways. If you're protecting the device 100% of the time and the data on the device to protect across the entire attack chain, it's a product called ZIPS, which stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. It's like next generation antivirus, EPP for mobile, right? However, if you have a mobile app and you want to protect the app and the session that app is having, so you're not trying to protect the device, we have an SDK where you can drop it in. It's called ZApp for in-app protection. You can put Z9 directly inside of your mobile app. So mobile banking customers of ours, for instance, use Zips to protect their employees and use ZApp to protect millions of mobile banking users. Both of those come in. Another huge advantage of doing all your detection on device, we're 100% cloud agnostic. It doesn't matter what cloud you put our console on. The guys that are doing cloud-based detection, our buddies in the industry, they're all locked into AWS. Another advantage, we can do on-prem. You can see down there's a little FedRAMP AWS GovCloud for you folks that are in the federal. We are the only FedRAMP ATO mobile threat defense solution. We integrate in with the most UEMs. I mentioned those earlier, and you can handle multiple UEMs in a single console with us, so that if you're on one and you're moving to another, no problem. If you inherited both, no problem. And then we take all of our data and put it into whatever SIM you're using. Behind Z Console, our console on the cloud, is a capability called Z3A. A huge thing we've noticed from the enterprise standpoint is there are perfectly legitimate apps. It stands for Advanced App Analysis. Those are the 3 A's. They're perfectly legitimate apps that are in your environment that are actual privacy and security nightmares. They might be sending traffic off unencrypted. They might be sending traffic to a foreign country. Any of those, you need to know those apps. So they're not malicious, but you still need to know about them. So with that, I'm going to stop for a second, realize that we're right at the bottom of the hour, and see if there are any questions before we let Andrew go and grab a hamburger before hopping on yet another flight. So let's see if there are any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Andrew, before we let you go, any other last thoughts or comments before I wrap things up?
Sure. Just yet again to reemphasize, the old proverbial is true as it ever has been. If it looks and smells like a fish, it probably is a fish. And you need a on-device agent and engine with the AI and the capability for machine learning that can actually detect the behavioral aspects of that particular fish in question for that particular day. And being able to do that on device without having to go back to a server or out to the cloud, or do reputation validation out on network that may or may not be in your control, is paramount to protection.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So my last thoughts on this whole thing, again, follow us on social media. Again, more than happy to send anybody who wants the slides, and even have a more detailed, because we're trying to make this, a 20, 25-minute conversation. I do think it's important, just like we talked about with CIS last week, and then with MITRE ATT&CK framework this week, they've taken the existing structures and they've layered mobile onto it. I personally think that's 1.0. Now, they might have different numbers for it, but that's 1.0, because especially when it comes to the attack framework side, I think there's the attack chain is the same. The elements are the same of what they're trying to accomplish. The techniques are fundamentally different. So I think the vertical part under each horizontal step of the attack chain is going to go through multiple revisions. And so I would suggest that people, pay attention to what's happening with MITRE as it continues to iterate. And then, of course, we will continue to let people know as things have changed as well. So with that, I would like to thank everybody, and hopefully this has been a useful exercise for you. And Andrew, thank you again for the time while you're sitting there at the airport. And safe travels, my friend, and we will talk to everybody soon.
Thanks for having me.